Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we're sharing with you some of the deadliest monsters in Dungeons & Dragons history. The legendary Tucker's Kobolds.
Tucker's Kobolds was first introduced in Dragon Magazine, issue number 127 of November 1987. This story, by editor Roger E. Moore, tells the cautionary tale of the dangers of low-level monsters, designed to help DMs plan encounters for higher-level campaigns.
The story describes a timeless problem. For over 35 years, Dungeon Masters have struggled to challenge their high-level player characters, and it offers solutions that are as useful today as they were way back in 1987, almost 35 years ago. And so today, we wanted to read and share with you the original Tucker's Kobold story as it appeared in the original Dragon magazine, and then talk about what some of the lessons are that Dungeon Masters can take away from this infamous tale.
There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
Tucker's Kobolds from Dragon Magazine 127, page 3, by Roger E. Moore. This month's editorial is about Tucker's Kobolds. We get letters on occasion asking for advice on creating high-level AD&D game adventures, and Tucker's Kobolds seem to fit the bill.
Many high-level characters have little to do because they're not challenged. They yawn at Tarrasques and must be forcibly kept awake when a lich appears. The DMs involved don't know what to do, so they stop dealing with the problem, and the characters go into character limbo. Getting to high level is hard, but doing anything once you get there is worse.
One of the key problems in adventure design lies in creating opponents who can challenge powerful characters. Singular monsters like Tarrasques and Liches are easy to gang up on. The party can concentrate its firepower on the target until the target falls down dead and wiggles its little feet in the air. Designing monsters more powerful than a Tarrasque is self-defeating. If the group kills your super monster, what will you do next? Send in its mother? That didn't work on Beowulf, and it probably won't work here.
Worse yet, singular super monsters rarely have to think. They just use their trusty, predictable claw bite. This shouldn't be the measure of a campaign. These games fall apart because there's no challenge to them, no mental stimulation, no danger.
In all the games that I've seen, the worst, most horrible, and most awful beyond comparison opponents ever seen were often weaker than the player characters who fought them. They were simply well-armed and intelligent beings who were played by the DM to be utterly ruthless and clever. Tucker's Kobolds were like that.
Tucker ran an incredibly dangerous dungeon in the days I was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. This dungeon had corridors that changed all of your donkeys into huge flaming demons, or dropped the whole party into acid baths. But the demons were weenies compared to the kobolds on level 1. These kobolds were just regular kobolds, with 1 to 4 hit points and all that. But they were mean. And when I say they were mean, I mean they were bad, Jim. They graduated magna cum laude from the Sauron Institute for the Criminally Vicious.
When I joined the gaming group, some of the PCs had already met Tucker's Kobolds and were not eager to repeat the experience. The party leader went over the penciled map of the dungeon and tried to find ways to avoid the little critters, but it was not possible. The group resigned itself to making a run through level 1 to get to the elevators, where we could go down to level 10 and fight okay monsters like huge flaming demons.
It didn't work. The kobolds caught us about 60 feet into the dungeon and locked the door behind us and barred it. Then they set the corridor on fire while we were still in it.
No! Screamed the party leader. It's them! Run!
Thus encouraged, our party scrambled down a side passage, only to be ambushed by more kobolds firing with light crossbows through murder holes in the walls and ceilings. Kobolds with metal armor and shields flung Molotov cocktails at us from the other sides of huge piles of flaming debris, which other kobolds pushed ahead of their formation using long metal poles like broomsticks. There was no mistake about it. These kobolds were bad. We turned to our group leader for advice.
Ah! He cried, hands clasped over his face to shut out the tactical situation. We abandoned most of our carried items and donkeys to speed our flight towards the elevators, but were cut off by kobold snipers who could split move and fire, ducking back behind stones and corners after launching steel-tipped bolts and arrows, javelins, hand axes, and more flaming oil bottles. We ran into an unexplored section of level 1, taking damage all the time. It was then we discovered the kobolds had honeycombed the first level with small tunnels to speed their movement. Kobold commandos were everywhere. Our hirelings died. Our henchmen followed. We were next.
I recall we had a 12th level magic user with us, and we asked him to throw a spell or something. Blast him, we yelled as we ran. Fireball him. Get those little...
What? In these narrow corridors? He yelled back. You want us to burn us all up instead of them?
Our panicked flight suddenly took us to a dead-end corridor, where a giant air shaft dropped straight down into unspeakable darkness, far past level 10. Here we hastily pounded spikes into the floors and walls, flung ropes over the ledges, and climbed straight down into that unspeakable darkness, because anything we met down there was sure to be better than these kobolds.
We escaped, met some huge flaming demons on level 10, and even managed to kill one after about an hour of combat and the lives of half the group. We felt pretty good, but the group leader could not be cheered up.
We still have to go out the way we came in, he said as he gloomily prepared to divide up the treasure.
Tucker's kobolds were the worst things we could imagine. They ate our donkeys and took our treasure and did everything they could to make us miserable, but they had style and brains and tenacity and courage. We respected them and loved them, sort of, because they were never boring.
If kobolds could do this to a group of PCs from 6th to 12th level, picture what a few orcs and some low-level NPCs could do to a 12th to 16th level group, or a gang of mid-level NPCs and monsters to groups of up to 20th level. Then give it a try. Sometimes it's the little things, used well, that count.
I think Roger E. Moore's story and his advice is so valuable even today, and I struggle to put it into more concise words, certainly.
I think that this story is incredible because so often as DMs, we throw away the weaker minions as the party gains levels. We think, well, how do we threaten them with the skeleton army? How do we threaten them with the goblins or the kobolds? If you're telling a narrative story where these little monsters should be a piece of that story all the way through, how do we continue to pose a threat? And the answer is just by making the monsters smarter.
Yeah, I think that this story really also shows how a dungeon master can blend monsters into their environment in a very, very cohesive way. The kobolds knew the layout of level 1 of the dungeon. They had tunneled through it and made it into their own. And they had used equipment, materials, and pretty basic tactics to pose a much more interesting challenge to player characters than kobolds could just trying to mob them.
I think that's some important advice for the DMs out there who are asking questions about this. And I do hear a lot of questions about, well, how can you argue that the kobolds or the goblins or the skeletons or whatever they are could do this if their intelligence is relatively low? And first and foremost, the mental ability scores in the game are intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. So first things first, high wisdom and low intelligence is still being wise about your surrounding environment. Secondly, every creature in the world builds a home and habitat that can protect themselves, is close to food, allows them to survive, and they know how to do this instinctually. They know how to hunt. They know how to protect themselves. These are inherent in nature, and we should expect no less from our kobolds and goblins. So a bunch of kobolds rigging their home with traps that they can easily avoid, but they know that intruders trying to get past or threaten them are going to have problems with, is completely likely.
And of course, the story even mentions the kobold commandos and leaders. The kobolds have obviously been working on this for a long time, and the story shows how a group of people working together cooperatively find ways to cooperate that might be much more intelligent and much more challenging than any of them on their own individually. I think that the kobolds are far more clever than many times we give them credit for, and I think that the plans they created were really, really smart and can be applied in a lot of different ways to other NPCs and monsters based on the environment that your player characters are working with. What I think is really cool about Tucker's Kobolds in particular is that the challenges that they posed made sense for what kobolds could create. It's not like the kobolds were building magical traps. It's not like they were building complex machinery or crazy death traps. They were working with scavenged material, weapons and armor. They were working with basic oil and fire. They didn't use anything in the story that was super complicated aside from the tools that they would be able to have with themselves. The digging and the channeling is pretty impressive, but kobolds like to burrow.
I think of one of the most iconic examples of this, if you're looking for media to inspire you, is the Ewoks from Star Wars. The Imperial troops thought that there was no issue on the planet of Endor because what were the Ewoks going to do? But then the Ewoks swoop in with log traps and rocks and all sorts of mundane equipment that the Empire overlooked. And this mundane equipment was able to undo them because it can be really dangerous when executed properly. And I think when we think of our lowly little kobolds or goblins or any other creature that might seem unassuming, think back to the Ewoks and how they were able to rig their entire forest with traps. And also remember the Ewoks were on their home ground.
Yep.
They knew the forest better than the Empire. And your enemies know their caves way better than the adventurers do. So they probably have all sorts of secret tunnels and passages and secret traps that they know each and every inch of, but the adventurers don't.
I mean, Return of the Jedi did come out in 1983, so I wonder if the Ewoks might have inspired this.
It's possible. The Ewoks are the perfect example of unassuming monsters. They're not monsters, but, well, they are. They eat people. Literally, there's some interesting things in the Ewok dietary options.
Yeah.
But the fact is that it's really that simple, I think, for DMs. And it's simple when you apply it, but it's complicated because we never think of it. We always throw our enemies at the party, look at the monster stat block, and say, cool, this is what I got to work with. But we often forget to think outside of the monster stat block. Just because a kobold says that it has a pointy stick or a net or whatever else it might have equipped, that doesn't mean that it can't have flasks with oil. That doesn't mean that it can't have flaming debris that it pushes forward with a stick. Think of the possible options that your monsters can use or manipulate, or things that they could put in their trapped dungeons. It doesn't have to be just what's on the stat block.
Now, you might say that this is also an example of a killer DM. The Dungeon Master employing brutal tactics that were overly complicated and tailored to take apart the player character specifically. But in defense of Tucker and the original story, I want to point out a few things. First of all, the player characters knew the kobolds were there at the start of the story. They had encountered the kobolds before and were plotting their route through the dungeon. This wasn't a surprise threat, especially in this specific story. Perhaps they'd encountered the kobolds once before and it was bad, but they were a threat that was aware of the player characters. Second of all, the player characters were able to run away and escape from the kobolds. They were able to plot that path, and even though things went kind of off the rails for the player's plan, there was still a way that the player characters could escape the kobolds, which I think is a very, very interesting element. One of the things about the original story is that I find kind of funny is that the kobolds killed the player's donkeys and hirelings, but none of the player characters actually died until they fought the demons on level 10.
I will also point out that in the examples in the story, we get a few references to maybe what they had equipped or brought with them. But with the right preparation, I think a party going into Tucker's Kobolds could have managed better. And so I do think that although this sounds like a death trap, and DMs should be aware of if they're creating a death trap for their players, because we don't necessarily want that. But if you have a higher level party, posing meaningful threats and putting those in front of them is not bad DMing. It's actually great DMing.
Especially when those threats are well telegraphed and you're giving your players an escape hatch if it's too much for them to deal with. It is very difficult to balance an encounter like this in a fair manner. The Tucker's Kobold story refers to characters that were between 6th and 12th level facing these kobolds. There's very explicitly a call out that the magic user, or the wizard, was a 12th level character, and thus would have had access to 4th, 5th, maybe even 6th level spells. So the kobolds are also explicitly said to be basic kobolds with 1 to 4 hit points. So this is an example of how once terrain and tactics are a factor, encounter balance kind of goes out the window. But I do agree with you, Kelly. I don't think that this was an unwinnable situation. And I think that Tucker, as a dungeon master, was really hoping his player characters were going to rise and meet this challenge with their own brilliant tactics and strategies. But unfortunately, the characters in the original Tucker's Kobold story just ran away because they weren't ready for this kind of tactical challenge.
So I think the lesson from Tucker's Kobolds is to think outside of the stat blocks, be creative and inventive with the terrain and the layers that you're presenting to your players. Think of ways that your low-level monsters can use their surrounding area to their advantage to pose meaningful threats to even higher-level player characters.
We're going to come back to Tucker's Kobolds and talk about how player characters can beat them in another episode of our show. But in the meantime, we would love to hear from you if you have any experiences using Tucker's Kobold-like enemies and how you beat them.
So tell us about those stories in the comments below.
The videos on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider supporting the channel by following the links down in the description below.
And if you want to see a group of characters fall into every trap and fail every riddle, you can check out our live play in the Worlds of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can check out all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got lots more advice for game masters right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.